when we talk bowl contracts between conferences, I think this is another good one that makes sense. It pits one of the better teams in the Big 12 every year against one of the better teams in the ACC. So this year, it's a West Virginia team that vied for the Big 12 title, finished 10-2, 16th in the country right now, taking on Miami. Mark Richt, much to do about him taking over the program, and they pretty much delivered what we expected. They didn't have that marquee win to break them through. They took Florida State to the wire. That could have been the game. But then they lost to the likes of North Carolina. They lost to the likes of some teams that you would expect them to. And it's another non-division championship year for Miami, but they get to a bowl game at 8-4, where they haven't won one for 10 years.
Yeah, who would have thought the worst loss on Miami's schedule this year arguably was Notre Dame at 4-8. If you looked at that game in the preseason, you would have said, wow, that game could really be a spectacle there out in South Bend. But it ends up being a matchup between a Miami team at that point that was meddling with mediocrity and Notre Dame, which has just been downright bad all season long. You look at Miami, though, they finished out the season strong, obviously 4 straight wins, one of those over Pitt, which was the biggest win out of the 4. It was 51-28, a game that really wasn't close when you consider where Pitt ended up, like we just mentioned there a moment ago. The way the Panthers were able to close the year, when you consider that Miami was able to beat them and beat them rather handily, it really springboarded the Hurricanes here through the final 3 or 4 games of their schedule into, of course, now the Russell Athletic Bowl against West Virginia. And I hope you like points in this game, Mark, because there are going to be a lot of them. The defenses are fine. Let's just put it that way. West Virginia's defense, I mean, they play okay by Big 10 or Big 12 standards, but they're not a great defense by any stretch of the imagination. The same can be said for Miami, even though both defenses have improved relatively well compared to where they were at the beginning of the year. Skylar Howard for West Virginia, he's a big-time quarterback. 3,100 yards passing, 26 touchdowns on the year. The guy's been spectacular. I mean, look at the receivers they have on the outside, namely Shelton Gibson, who's really been the playmaker for him. 40 catches on the year, 927 yards, 8 touchdowns. They look for him in the middle of the field. They look for him in the red zone. He's been a guy that's been spectacular for them all year long, and really they put up a ton of points there, not only in the passing game, but in the rushing game as well. Obviously, when you look at their leading rusher in Justin Crawford, 1,100 yards rushing on the year, only had 4 touchdowns. They do a lot of their scoring through the air. Skylar Howard also likes to run the ball a little bit as well. So West Virginia is a dynamic offense. They like to spread you out and throw the ball a ton. That's something that Miami has struggled with defensively for most of the year. When you consider some of the losses that they've had, North Carolina and Notre Dame, teams that have a lot of receivers on the outside and a lot of guys who can make plays in space. That's where Miami's defense has struggled. So it'll be interesting here in this game to see how they adapt in the Russell Athletic Bowl. Can Miami score enough points? Definitely can. Brad Kaya, say what you want about him. He struggled with accuracy issues early in the year. He entered his senior season here at Miami as one of the top-rated quarterbacks on a lot of NFL boards. Finished the year not so, just because of the accuracy issues like I referred to, but the way that he closed the season out, he really started to step into his own there and become the quarterback that Mark Richt was looking for there in the last month of the year. Finishes with 3,200 yards passing, 23 touchdowns to 7 interceptions. He's been really good coming in on a hot streak. It'll just be interesting to see how he reacts with a little more than a month off to prepare for his West Virginia game. The big story here for Miami as the season's kind of progressed is the offensive line has really improved. And a lot of that can be said with Mark Walton in the running game. He cracked 1,000 yards rushing, 14 touchdowns. He's their lead back. They like to run Joe Yearby as well, kind of thunder and lightning type combo they have going there at Miami. So they like to run the ball a ton to open up the pass and throw to guys like freshman receiver Amon Richards, who's been spectacular, 866 yards receiving, only 2 touchdowns on the year, but he's been primarily a possession receiver. But he's really developed as the year's gone on. He's been more of a downfield passing threat for Miami, which they really want to see him develop into as he progresses in his collegiate career. So Amon Richards has really come on strong here for Miami this year. But they have a lot of playmakers. I mean, they've obviously recruited well, even when they were struggling under Al Golden. Miami's always a school that can recruit the athletes. They got plenty of offense to keep up with West Virginia. It'll come down to which team makes enough stops in this game. I think it's going to be Miami just because, once again, West Virginia, outside of a couple games in their conference schedule, they really haven't played a ton of tough opponents this year. I think Miami has kind of run the gamut here in the ACC. They finished with 8-4. I know that they play in a weaker ACC Coastal Division, but they saw teams like Virginia Tech. They played against a Notre Dame team that, despite being down, does have a ton of athletes on both sides of the ball, offensively and defensively. And then you look at a team like Pittsburgh that Miami was able to handle. They're a team that had a lot of offense and struggled on defense, just like West Virginia. I think the teams are very similar in that regard. And because we kind of have that there on the slate where Miami has performed relatively well there against a team like Pittsburgh that's similar in style offensively to West Virginia, I think Miami's going to find a way to make enough stops to win this football game. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, it'll be first team to 50 wins, and I think Miami will be that team.
Mike, I've made a lot of friends with Big 12 observers this year because I've repeatedly said it's the worst conference in college football, in the Power Five, of course, and it's not even close. So I think the ACC is decidedly, even in that division, decidedly better than the Big 12. Forget the records, forget the rankings. I know West Virginia had a fine season, but when they matched up against the better teams in the Big 12, even in their own building in a snowstorm that should have been to their advantage against Oklahoma, they were blown out of the building. The best team that they played out of conference was BYU. They struggled to get a win there. For Miami, top to bottom on that roster, I don't think there's any question that they have more talent and more speed on the roster than West Virginia does. What it comes down to me with Miami is the same thing that we've talked about now for 2 or 3 years, and hopefully Mark Richt, for Miami fans' sake, is going to correct it, and that's the offensive line. They need to protect Brad Kaya. And I don't know that West Virginia's got the type of talent as edge rushers to take advantage of the issues that Miami has along the offensive line, but it's also running the ball. So Miami comes out of the gate this year, Mike, as you well know, and they run it down the throats of 3 inferior foes. And we thought, okay, Mark Richt, he's fixed the running game. They got 2 quality backs. This is going to be a Miami ground game that's going to really set up play action, and Kaya is going to be in great shape. But once they started to face decent defenses in the ACC, not even great defenses like Georgia Tech, couldn't run the ball. So I put it on the offensive line for Miami. If the offensive line just plays, if they just work out some issues in that 4-week gap between the last game and the West Virginia game in the Russell Athletic, I think Miami's going to be in good shape in this one.
Yeah, and Miami's offensive line, to what you just said, I mean, the offensive line played a lot better towards the end of the year, and I think that's the one encouraging thing if you're a Hurricanes fan. A, they protected Brad Kaya. B, maybe more importantly, they ran the ball a lot better than they had in the weeks prior. You saw it at the beginning of the year. They had the really, really solid running attack, but there were 3 inferior opponents, like you mentioned. And then once conference play started, the offensive line play just got worse. They had some injuries that kind of decimated both sides of the lines on offensive and the defensive lines that really held them back throughout the early part of conference play, but they got healthier as the season went along. The offensive line started to be a little bit more cohesive as a unit. And what we saw is a stronger Miami rushing attack. And if that's the case in this bowl game against West Virginia, I think they'll be in good shape.
If you love ACC sports, check out Mike McDaniel inside the ACC. His Twitter handle is Mike McDaniel ACC. If you love the conference across the board, if you love football, you can check me out there as well, because even when the season's over, Mike and I will mix it up when it comes to recruiting, getting you set for National Signing Day. And we've also have launched, as we mentioned, a YouTube channel, Mark Rogers TV ACC, plenty of videos there. So, Mike, we appreciate the time, man.
All right. Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it.